and I think tells us a number of things about MK. The one is that they're in this kind of cycle of political theater, spectacle, kind of fascination with politics of that kind, which is something that we say about the ANC every election, right?
Yeah.
They take a long time to get moving, but once they do, it's a kind of bullet train in terms of campaigning. Look, I still think the EFF is an important dynamic in this election. I'm not casting them off by any stretch. If we go into like big coalition negotiations, it's going to be so complex that like even a conversation about real policy in that moment is going to be difficult.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX on this election day. And today I am very excited to be joined by researcher at the SWOP at WITS, Tasneem Essop, who has joined us before on this channel and is a friend of SMWX. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Cesar.
Yeah, we haven't had you in a few years now, but
the last time was COVID. So
oh my word.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, well, this sounds like the perfect day to have a conversation about South African politics.
Right.
Indeed. I guess, as usual, we've been starting with MK because MK is, in some ways, the story of this election so far. We'll see what happens after the results. How do you make sense of the emergence of MK onto the scene and the role that former President Zuma has played back from the dead in South African politics?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely the story of this election. And look, there's a number of interesting things that can be said, but just following the track of the story of this election, I think they have gotten kind of disproportionate amount of coverage. I think I read an MMA report last night about the kind of media coverage that that the different parties have received, and MK was second to the ANC, which I think is really interesting, right? Yeah. And I think tells us a number of things about MK. The one is that they're in this kind of cycle of political theater, spectacle, kind of fascination with politics of that kind. A space that I think the EFF has occupied really well since they came onto the scene. But this year, you know, MK's kind of usurped that position a little bit, which I think is interesting. The other thing it shows us is, and this is together with the kind of entry of a lot of other small parties and the attention that they've gotten in this election, that there is this like search for alternatives and what that alternative would be, and you know, the kind of value judgments around that. So I think MK is part of that. So I think that alone, them being the story of this election, kind of tells us a lot in itself. And then of course there's a lot to be said for MK, right? Of course the most obvious thing is the name is what they signal in our politics and in our political history, right?
Yeah.
So taking that strand of history from the ANC, from the liberation struggle, that iconography, that kind of like militarism, which has had successful resonance in South African society over time, I think is really significant. But importantly, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, is that they don't take on all of the politics of the ANC. So I think there's a very interesting thing about tradition and history here, and at the same time, a kind of new, well, maybe not new set of ideas. It's actually not a new set of ideas, but something different from the core politics of the ANC. And I think that's a very interesting kind of move that they've made.
Agreed. And how would you further characterize that politics? Because I think we maybe have focused, as you say, on the theater of MK and not actually looked at the substance. Now, there are some who say that MK doesn't have a manifesto. I think it does now on some website that I've seen. But the politics of MK is clear, and I think we can discern it. And it is a different combination of forces than we've ever actually seen before.
Sure. And I think that's interesting. I think we were speaking before this interview that they're a curveball because it's hard to kind of assess what their performance is going to be based on previous examples, right? And even something like the EFF it cannot really be compared to MK. Right? It's something new in that sense that we have to confront in this election.
Yeah.
I mean, a former president that's established his own political party to contest the ANC while still saying he's a member of the ANC. I mean, that's interesting. But in terms of like characterizing the politics of
Yeah.
of MK, it's been a mixed bag, right? And so where you can kind of draw a political line with a lot of other parties and use those terms that we have to describe parties, right? Left leaning, social democrat, on center left, center right, conservative, libertarian, whatever those terms are. It's very hard to pin one of those onto MK, and so
Yeah.
it makes it difficult to understand it. But also, we haven't been able to engage with this party over a long period of time. So what we have to go on really is an election campaign. And so yeah, there is that kind of difficulty with characterizing them in the here and now.
Yeah. Yeah. When I look at it, I think it also in some ways forms part of a global trend of new players who are combining aspects of left and right in unpredictable ways. So if we think economically, it seems to me that they are on the left to the extent that they seem to want greater participation in the economy. They seem to want land reform. Whether they would implement this if they governed is a different thing. But their platform seems to be economically more to the left than the ANC or the DA. Socially, I think they're actually on the right, where there's a strand of social conservatism, which I see coming through. And then politically, I'm not so sure how much I don't know what the left and right is politically, but if we're talking about democracy and a belief in democracy, I don't know where they are. I think they're clearly participating in this election, but there's always this looming threat that they also don't quite buy into the democratic system, at least as it currently stands.
Yeah, I mean, so let me start with the first point, which is that I think there's a large section of South African society that could be constituted as politically progressive and socially conservative. And I think that's a kind of paradox in South African society that
So true.
a lot of parties have had to contend with, right? And that's why I think we see the popularity of some pretty socially conservative ideas around gender, queer politics, around immigration and xenophobia, and a range of other questions. I mean, I won't leave it there. Those are just few to mention. And yet, at the same time, there's this push to redistribute resources, redistribute land, get the economy working in a more egalitarian fashion.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of the issue that we face as a society. And I think the political parties, in some ways, reflect this, right? So there's that element. The last point I wanted to respond to, but it's fallen out the back of my head.
Well, I was talking about the maybe it was the political thing, like the belief in democracy versus.
Sure, yeah.
And also, I think there's an interesting fault line in this election. I would say the center of political persuasion is the Constitution, and then there's a right critique of the Constitution, which is like it gives everyone too many rights and all of that. And then there's a left critique, which is like it constrains redistribution. And it feels like the MK is on both of those extremes at the same time, actually.
Yeah, so I remembered what I was going to say, which is that the kind of hesitation around their commitment to democratic, we can even call them liberal democratic values, is based on what has been said from the party in this election, right? And particularly around the kind of questioning of the Constitution. And I think the point you make is very important, that there is a left critique of the Constitution, right? And that this was a critique that I most prominently remember being made during Fees Must Fall, actually, around how you can both use the Constitution to advance kind of goals towards things like free education, but at the same time that it's limiting, right? And that the kind of framework of the Constitution does not give expression to the full range of socioeconomic rights that people believe they're entitled to, right? So there is that critique, but I think this is sort of where what you're getting at, is the critique that MK is making based on that. And I think there is a part of it that is based on a kind of popular critique that has developed around the constitution, right? And the constitutional dispensation. But there must be some sort of commitment to the kind of civic and political rights.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the question marks are, right? Is that if you are going to critique the constitution in such a way where, what do you say? Where's the line in terms of democratic values, in terms of civic and political rights? And I think there is a critique to be made around the kind of liberal democratic, post 1994 consensus, right? And this is also something that MK does in a way, right? They pick up on that critique. People like yourself have made parts of this critique around, what the 1994 consensus means, and how we need to shift that politics of negotiations, of transition.
Yeah. I'm glad someone read the book.
Well, I'm sure lots of people did. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really fascinating unpacking of the MK. Actually, unlike I've seen anywhere before yet. And I guess what is also interesting about the MK is that it's almost like a conditional support politically for the status quo, to the extent that it can get them into parliament. But then once they're there, who knows what they're going to do. And I think this is most evident in the way they look at the IEC. And I think for the first time we have what could be a major political force. Because before it's been like very small parties saying like we didn't get our votes. But the EFF has always been very clear: after elections, we accept the results. We may have a major political force in this election that casts aspersions over the IEC. Well, it actually already has. So that is a bit of a worrying feature of the MK to some extent, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, MK has this kind of insider-outsider politics thing going on, right? And like earlier you spoke about global trends of bringing together left and right ideas. And I think this also follows something of a global trend around like globally more outsider politics. But here, I mean, because former President Zuma is a former president of the nation, is a former president of the ANC, has been part of the post 1994 consensus, right? And many others in MK2, right?
Yeah.
So it has that character of being both insider and outsider, and so that that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of the IEC, in terms of the National Assembly, in terms of legislatures, right?
Yeah.
To see how that kind of holds, and we don't have that really outsider feature yet in South African politics, right?
Yeah.
Everyone on the scene seems to come from somewhere that we are familiar with in a way.
Absolutely. Well, it's going to be interesting to see what becomes of MK. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, how do we predict MK when we have nothing to go on?
Well, we only have a few, maybe like 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, what we've been going on so far is polling, and is kind of like anecdotal, qualitative, if you want to call it in some ways, stuff that people say about it, right? Whether that's during the election campaign, on radio, on social media, things like that. So it is very difficult to kind of predict where they're going to fall, and I think given the polling can only take so far, and I think we've made, like many people have made the critique before around like methodologies of polling and so on. So we do have to wait and see, but they've already been a force in this election, and I think they're going to be part of our conversation afterwards.
For sure. Let's come on to the ANC. What do you make of this election campaign from them? And what's going on with the ANC in your view?
Yeah, it's picked up. I think there was a point where, it was looking a lot more negative on their side, but I think they've definitely picked up the campaign, which is something that we say about the ANC every election, right?
Yeah.
They take a long time to get moving, but once they do, it's a kind of bullet train on you know, in terms of campaigning. And that's part of the kind of party infrastructure that they have. And if I can just jump back quickly to MK, I think an important point to be made here is how they utilized tapped into a kind of party an existing party infrastructure.
Definitely.
And this is something that I said about the EFF and the ANC Youth League when they first arrived on the scene, which I think is important for laying a foundation for like laying a foundation for a political platform.
Yeah.
But you know, going back to the ANC, I think they have that kind of party infrastructure to get moving on the campaign. Their campaign's been interesting. Their campaign messaging has been similar to previous years, but I think in the 2019 election we saw a lot of Ramaphoria ideas, kind of new dawn.
Absolutely.
And we haven't seen as much of that in this election.
Yeah.
It's definitely been you know, more about let's look back on like 30 years. Let's look at the gains we've made. And what the ANC does really well is being a broad church, right? They speak to the broadest possible constituencies in South Africa, which I don't see any other party doing, right? Every other party speaks to its constituencies, to people that it believes will vote for it. And I think while the ANC does this in some respects, they know where to get their votes from, right? Yeah. But in terms of their public positioning, they still speak to the broadest possible section of South African society. And I think they've kind of stuck to that, which is what they know, right?
Yeah, it seems to me they've had two messages. The major message is things are better after 94, which we kind of heard in 2014, like you say. But then there's like this minor message which is coming through, which is we know things are bad now, but we promise if you just get us over the line this time, things will be better in the next 5 years. We know we didn't quite live up to expectations, but we will now.
Yeah, one more chance.
Yeah.
One more chance. Yeah, that's been an important part of their kind of messaging. It's interesting to look back at the last election and what the key conversations around that election were, and actually in terms of the ANC, how different that is now, right?
So true.
So yeah, corruption's still part of it, but corruption was a massive part of the last two national elections, right? It's still part of the conversation now, but it isn't the like, if you pull out one of those word clouds, I wonder, you know, how big that word would be in it. And this idea of like one rescuer for the ANC has dimmed down. Right? Yeah. So they're definitely using that history, you know, to kind of say, give us one more chance. Things will turn around. That there's been improvements over the last few years, and I think we can, you know, that can be debated. Right? Yeah.
What do you make of that argument? What do you make of President Ramaphosa's term and the last 5 years?
Well, this is around the time you do a final analysis of the New Dawn.
Yeah. Oh, that old thing.
Yeah, that old. I mean, that was a big part of the last election, right? The New Dawn.
Can you remember how big the New Dawn was? Yeah. Like you couldn't go anywhere for that narrative.
Yeah. I mean, and hope was in high supply.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, yes, it was.
It's a powerful currency, and I don't know how much of it we have at the moment, but you know, it's that kind of tone that's very different. But look, a full analysis of the kind of last 5 years will take quite a while to get through, and I think it's been mixed, and I think that's what we've seen coming out of those who have been analyzing the last 5 years. Of course, there's been a pandemic in between, and you know, and a serious economic downturn, and I don't think you can analyze the last 5 years in isolation of the past 30 years, right? So yeah, I mean, I would say it's mixed, both politically, in terms of governance, in terms of the economy, and there will be people on either side of this debate, right?
Yeah. Well, you were one of the few people who didn't buy into the New Dawn narrative. I think there were like 4 of us in South Africa, but hey,
it was tough for us.
It was tough. You know, having said that though, I get a different feeling about this election because I remember I remember 2019, and I remember the wave of ANC support. And never mind 2014. Like I distinctly remember 2014, particularly on what was then Twitter. And the ANC had this thing where you would put the ANC logo by your profile picture. And there was some point at which, like, everyone, and you were just like, wow, this wave is just unstoppable. And there were posters everywhere, and then the ANC would be able to bring out the veterans, and I'm talking about the real veterans. Like, they'd bring out Kathrada, and they'd bring out like Andrew Mlangeni. And it feels to me this time, I could be wrong, but I don't get that sense of like an unstoppable tide that I've got in other elections. And it's the first time I felt like, yes, there has been a final surge. I can't deny that. But it hasn't felt like the other surges where you kind of feel like everyone is voting ANC and they're proud about it.
I mean, if I had to use one word to describe this election, it would be uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely the mood of this election. And I think you're speaking to that in a way that like that wave of ANC support. But it's because, I mean, I believe it's because this year is the first election since '94 that there's been question marks around the ANC securing an outright majority, and that has caused a lot of uncertainty. And I think it's caused a lot of people to think about where they're going to put their vote in a different way, right? The calculation that a voter makes, and I think every voter does this. Every voter makes a calculation.
Yeah.
That calculation is different because of that complexion to this election. And I think this argument can go both ways, right? The idea that the ANC is going to dip below 50%, might lead to some saying, well, I think someone said this, let's jump off a sinking ship, you know? At the same time, I think it might cause a lot of people to think, well, this is the year then that you have to go out, vote for the ANC so that they can get over that 50%, right? So I don't think it's as simple as the ANC is going down, we move on to another party. I think it's like quite a complex calculation, but definitely uncertainty is the mood of this election. There's so many new dynamics in it, right? It's the ANC possibly falling below 50%. It's the three ballots. It's like these practical kind of things.
Yeah.
It's voting only at the station that you're registered at. These are different dynamics, right? That cause that sense of uncertainty. It's MK Party arriving on the scene.
Yeah.
It's Rise Mzansi. It's Action SA. It's Bossa. It's Patriotic Alliance contesting an election. So I think there's all of these kind of new things in this election that make it quite uncertain for the voter and have that kind of impact on the national mood.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also what happens with opposition voters as well, because absolutely, we've never seen ANC voters really feeling vulnerable, like they actually could lose, and that could excite the ANC base to be like, there's all to play for and we have to all come out. But then you've got these opposition voters who are like, we can actually make this happen. Like, if we come out, then the ANC could fall below 50. So you don't know which base and which set of impulses is actually going to. And then you've got this other set of like impulses, which is, what if I vote against the ANC and then we go into this instability? So even though I don't like the ANC, I also don't like instability. So now what do I do?
And for a lot of people, I don't like the idea of coalitions as we've seen them play out, right? And for voters in municipalities that have been run by some pretty disastrous coalitions, that will be part of their calculations,
Absolutely.
right? And others have watched it play out. In certain municipalities. So that idea, that coalition dynamic also throws another factor into this election, and I think is again part of it, right? What happens after this? What happens after the ANC loses its majority? I think the opposition has obviously campaigned, a lot of the opposition has obviously campaigned on that idea that it's possible in this election. Therefore, we must go out, we must vote, and we must form a coalition. I mean, the DA started this campaign well before anyone else did.
Yeah.
In terms of the multi-party charter. And I think others have picked up on this. Even the slogan 1994 is 2024 is our 1994. And I think it speaks to that there's a sense of this being the possibility. The door is open. The door is open.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. You alluded to the EFF earlier, and you made a remark about the way that in some ways they have not been able to have a big bearing over the narrative like they usually do. They always punch above their weight in terms of media interest and controversy. And it seems like in this election, to some extent, the MK has played that role.
Yeah. Look, I still think the EFF is an important dynamic in this election. I'm not casting them off by any stretch. And I mean, there's been an almost acceptance that they're going to go to the fourth largest party. And I'm certainly not sure about that. I'm not sure that MK is going to get more votes than them.
Yeah.
They're well established now. And actually, in the post-apartheid kind of landscape of political parties, you have to give EFF their credit in terms of being able to establish, maintain a party with some sense of stability, for over 10 years now.
Which has been growing as well.
Which has been growing. And I think that's the question in this election. So as much as MK has, as I said earlier, taken on a lot of that spectacle, that theatre of politics, the EFF is still there. But the question in this election is the EFF going to grow, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, having said that, I'm not sure how much that matters, right? Because the EFF has made quite a significant impact since the first national election that they've contested, right? And whether they grow so the EFF knows they're not going to win this election, right? No opposition party is going to win this election.
That's for sure.
And so I think the EFF has done enough in the last 10 years to ensure that they will be part of the conversation after this election. And I think that's important, right? That if they grow by 1 or 2%, it's really, they're still in the same position in terms of their role in the important kind of role that they will take on after this election, as if they didn't, right? So, there's been reports that suggest that they're going to stagnate in this election, but they're going to be a massive part of our conversation after this. And I think that's a given based on the work that they've done over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I feel like they've been the talk of elections so often, and this time they've had to realize that when you're a more established party, you're not always going to get that, like you're the new shiny object in the election. And they've had to really turn out their base. And I think that's, in many ways, even if they don't grow massively, which I think they might have had MK not been around, it might still be an achievement just to having not dominated the media cycle, maintain where they are.
No, I would agree with that. I should have said earlier that part of the reason the MK is in the media cycle so much has been because of the kind of court cases and all of that. And then I also think there is a critique to be made of public discussions around elections and what the substance of that is when it comes to both the way we've confronted MK and the way we've confronted the EFF over time, right? No, but I think what you're saying is right about the EFF, that the position that they're in is fine, and they have turned out their base, and they've run a campaign similar to what they've run before. Their campaign messaging, land and jobs, has been up there before. One new component of that is the electricity question, which is interesting, right? It's interesting to have like land and jobs, which are these massive kind of like hit to the very core of our society, right? Historically, and in the present. And there's all like a whole range of like arguments that can be made about this from, the colonialism, pretty much. And then throughout the liberation, struggle into the transition, the post 94 dispensation. So those are like, and then there's this thing of electricity, right, which stands there, and I think it shows just how important they view it in relation to turning out voters and resolving that crisis. But I think it's a really interesting thing to put up against these two.
Definitely. And that also takes us to one of the absolute shocks of this election, which is like the disappearance of load shedding. I could never have predicted it.
So cynical.
No, no, like seriously, I really thought like load shedding was beyond repair and it was going to take like 5 years to, like, I'm just shocked. I'm honestly, I can't believe we've had this uncapped electricity for the entire election. And if it does come back after this election, I'm going to be so angry, like, because that will reveal an obvious political ploy that is just unconscionable. But if it also stays away, then like, hey, happy days.
Yeah, happy days indeed. So I read an article a few weeks back, and I'm sorry I can't remember the person who wrote it, but it was referring to looking at the numbers in terms of how much diesel is being burnt and so on. And I think the suggestion made in the article was that there isn't like a high amount of diesel being burnt now to keep the lights on, and
so I hear as well.
So I mean, I think. Of course, it's an election, and we're going to talk about this in the context of an election, and we have every reason to be cynical, right? So, but load shedding is bound to come back, right? So you might as well gear up your anger already, just because we haven't resolved the fundamental electricity crisis. It's going to return, whether this is a lucky spot, whether it's intentional, whether it's based on the weather. I mean, I'm no expert on this, right? I'm pretty sure it's going to come back.
Probably tomorrow, actually. But
well, that would be, I mean, if it comes back tomorrow, then I think we can pretty much say you're right.
Yeah. Well, we shall see. We shall see what happens with that. On that, to step away from the party political situation, we will come back to the DA in a while. But I wonder to what extent this election is going to represent actual policy change, no matter what outcome we get. So there's a lot of talk that, and the DA has tried to paint this picture that an EFF ANC government or even an ANC MK or EFF, some combination of the two, would be this horrific scenario in which the state collapses and whatever. And then there's also this view that the DA-ANC coalition would be like fundamentally different to how the ANC has already governed. And I'm not so sure if either of those will represent a massive policy shift either way. I think we're probably going to get a very symbolic change and a political change, and then everything's going to go back to pretty much normal with a lot more political noise.
Well, there's an argument to be made that elections are a symbolic exercise. Let's not go there today. It's a really loaded question, right? Because there's a few layers to unpack here.
Yeah.
The first is, for me, around whether the parties involved here represent significantly different positions, right?
Absolutely.
And I think we have seen, definitely on the social questions, very different views emerging in this election, right? And I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
But I think even on the economic and socioeconomic questions, we've seen those differences emerging between parties that in the past we've said have coalesced around the center, right? And I think there's been minor shifts made in quite a number of parties that have made these distinctions a lot more clear. So if you take a question like the universal basic income, if you take something like employment equity, right? These have been big talking points. If you take the response to the energy crisis, right? Their position on climate, you can kind of see very distinct positions emerging right around this. So I don't think you can say any longer that there's kind of a coalescing in the center. So in that sense, I think that there could be starker differences than we imagine. Will that translate to policy changes? Is the real part of your question, right? And there it becomes a game of politics, right?
Yeah.
Who positions themselves where? What policy positions do they take on as significant to their role in a coalition? If we get to a national coalition, for example, and I'm not saying we will. But so it does depend on what's put forward as a key part of the policy decisions after this election, given that we've seen these differences emerging in the political space, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Having said all of that, and I think this is another layer we need to go to. At the same time as I would say that we've seen these differences emerging on particular social, economic, and political questions, right? I think that we have also seen that we come back again and again to the idea that we lack political alternatives, that we lack new political ideas.
Yeah.
And I said this in the last election, and I'm still here, right? And I don't think it's an incorrect argument to say that there's still a search for alternatives. There's still a search for new ideas. There's still a sense that we haven't got to a place where we understand the vision of, for the next 20 years, what's going to take us forward, right? So if we're going to critique 1994, if we're going to reflect properly on 30 years of democracy, right, then we have to also acknowledge that there's a lack of ideas to take us into the next dispensation, if you will.
Yeah. Well, on the question of the policy shifts, so my thinking at the moment, assuming there's a coalition, and of course, if there isn't a coalition, then more of the same is guaranteed. Okay, and now I'm talking about the worst case scenario where like the ANC can't get even small parties. So let's just imagine that scenario. Let's say there's a DA ANC coalition, right? I think there's a lot to be said that the DA and the ANC actually agree on a lot of macroeconomic policy. So what would be left is foreign policy, where there's a clear divergence.
Huge, yeah.
And especially on Gaza and maybe BRICS. And then there's social/economic policy, which is like affirmative action, employment equity. Now, if I'm the DA and I touch employment equity, like, what a terrible move, because that's going to create a backlash to end all backlashes. Like, we've never seen yet in South Africa those kind of things be threatened. And I think you would almost get like protest movements that would just be massive, I think. So I don't know if I touch that if I'm the DA.
Look, protest movements are my field, so let's go.
Okay, yeah.
No.
We've got the right expert in the room.
No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a bit difficult to say, right? Because the kind of coalitions that could come about, and we're talking here about a hypothetical worst case scenario, right? And if
of course,
if we lean into that, so before I get there, I just want to say that it is like what we're going to see if we go into like big coalition negotiations is going to be so complex that like even a conversation about real policy in that moment is going to be difficult to have, right?
Yeah.
It's gonna blow your minds, right? If it gets to that level.
We're not ready for the next 2 weeks. We actually are not.
Yeah, no. Should have got enough sleep in previously.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think so much of it depends on what the coalition is and how it's structured, right? How those coalitions are structured. But there's some things that some political parties simply won't be able to push, even if they are on the table of a coalition.
Absolutely.
And that's going to have to be an acceptance that's made. And in some ways, coalitions can foster kind of conservative politics. And I don't mean this in the sense of like economic conservatism or whatever. I mean it in the sense of like you have to play a very safe game in a coalition because you're balancing so many different interests.
Yeah. You have to find common denominators and
Yeah, but I mean, I agree. There are some policy positions that are so polarizing that it's going to cause such a public reaction
Yeah.
if it goes forward. You know.
And I feel in the DA-ANC very unlikely scenario, etc. We've never seen what civil society and the country will do if some of the core things that we agree with that the ANC has given us are under threat. And suddenly I think we would find a situation in which now people would be like, let's test the popularity of employment equity. And okay, if the DA wants to do that, good luck to them is all I can say, because I literally think that coalition would end like right there. If they're like, we're coming for the labor market, we're coming for employment equity, we're coming for BRICS, we're coming for Gaza, it's over. It's over, DA.
No,
Like,
a lot of those are bridges too far
Yeah,
to get across. And I think even for the public, like,
absolutely.
leave the kind of elite politics that will play out. But even in the public, I think they would be too far.
Yeah.
On the civil society question, we
Yeah.
have seen how civil society responds to a DA government, at least in the Western Cape. So I think there's something to go on there.
Sure,
right?
sure.
And we have seen the reaction to the DA government over a long period of time. So it's maybe something to consider in our calculations about this hypothetical.
Yeah, that's true. Controversially as well, the reverse side of the coin, an EFF MK ANC coalition, the so-called doomsday scenario, I also don't think would be that different to what we have. Like, I feel like we've already seen what Zuma governs like, which is exactly the same as the ANC generally. And then the EFF, number one, again, I don't think they're going to be in a very strong position to dictate policy. They may extract some symbolic concessions here and there. But I know I'm probably in the minority on this. I don't feel that coalition is going to be it's going to be very symbolically different, but I don't see it being hugely substantively different.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because they're all birthed in the same place, right?
Exactly. This was actually one party like 2 election cycles ago.
No,
3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 3 election cycles ago. All of this was one party. All of these parties were one. But again, you know, I think there are interesting differences in policy, right? But I think there's a possibility that there are parts of these parties that could find each other in different ways to kind of ANCDA scenario. So I think there are, and it's because they all come from the same place, right? That there are elements there are parts of the ANC that could find parts of the EFF. There are parts of the ANC that could perhaps find parts of MK. I mean, on that one, I'm less clear actually.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
So yeah, but nonetheless, I think on the big kind of questions that the EFF has staked their campaign around, I think it will be difficult, right? And again, it's going to cause a public reaction. Maybe not in the same way as what we were talking about in terms of something like employment equity.
Huge public,
but it will have that.
Oh, the media will go into an absolute meltdown. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think reports that I've read at least suggest that the kind of markets will accept a DA-ANC coalition far better than a EFF ANC or an EFF ANC MK coalition.
Yeah.
And I mean, the whole positioning around this doomsday scenario from DA and maybe other players on the scene has been another interesting part of the selection, right? To run your campaign based on that idea of this kind of worst case scenario for South Africa. I think has been pretty spectacular, actually.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's just been the most wrong-headed thing in this entire election. So let's come on to the DA. What do you make of what they've done, and what do you think their prospects are in this election?
They started earlier than everyone else. I think I mentioned this with the multi-party charter. They had a kind of idea of where they were going with this election. I'm not sure they got it right for me, right? But I think they may have got it right for them.
Yeah.
And what I mean by this is that, and this has been said by so many people now, right? So it's a bit of repetition, but the DA has given up on the possibility of ever winning an election in this country.
Yeah.
They've given up on growing to a significant level in this election, right? And the party has said as much. They've said that they're not trying to get votes of people who are not going to vote for them.
Yeah.
They're getting votes of people that they think are part of those who will vote for them. So they also have gone to their traditional base, right? If we want to use that kind of language. So, I think maybe that, okay. And also the DA says very often that they base their election campaign on kind of research around what political positions would bode best for them. They do that kind of like market related research in a way, which is also an interesting way to run a campaign in South Africa. So I think that brings us to the conclusion that they believe that message is the right one to push in this election, right? But we have seen a kind of backlash to the flag burning thing, even to the doomsday scenario. So that's why I said, for me, I'm not sure about this, but for them, they clearly back this concept. But that has to be based on the idea that you cannot grow any further. That there are certain people that you simply will never convince on your kind of conservative liberal. Ideas.
I think I agree. I think they have their 20% or thereabouts, and they're happy to keep that. And hey, DA voters turn up. DA voters will go to the polls and they will deliver that 20% or thereabouts, like pretty much no matter what the DA says anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also kind of indicates to us that the DA believes that their path to power it lies in a coalition. And that's what they've put a lot of their energy into, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. The DA will turn out their base.
Yeah, and they're good at turnout as well.
But they'll be eaten into in certain respects, right? And I think in the last election we spoke about this in relation to Freedom Front Plus, particularly, if I recall correctly, in 2019.
Yeah.
In this election, there are a few more parties that will potentially eat into that DA base. Maybe not in huge ways, and I think there's a lot of parties that will take from small pools of other bases, right? I don't know if I like this language of traditional bases and all of that, but anyways, let's go with it for now. Right? So there's other parties that kind of fit in that spectrum of the of politics. And I think you're likely to see some eating away of that DA base. So that's also significant. And another thing to say here, right? In as much as we talk about the ANC, the EFF, MK, and how they all come from the same kind of place, right? The DA has had its fractures too, right? So many political parties on the ballot this year come directly from fractures in the DA. Bosa, Action SA, Good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if there's three fractures on that side, the DA can equal that, which I don't think we talk about enough in terms of how that party has also fractured in really significant ways that have shaped this election.
It'll be interesting to see with all these parties what happens after the election and in what position the leaders will be, because I think a lot changes when those results come through, and people's political fortunes can rise and fall based on those results. So we shall see.
Yeah, and the DA has, after the last election, there was a whole conversation about Mmusi Maimane as leader of the party, right? So they have a precedent for having that kind of conversation after an election.
As we close, any other thoughts, hopes, and fears for election day as people go to the polls?
Yeah, hopes and I think I said earlier that I'm not sure how much hope we have, but look, I think I look forward to having a greater sense of certainty after this.
That will be ideal.
To do away with the uncertainty that I've at least been sitting with, and I think other people too. And let's see how it pans out. I think our most interesting conversations will happen in the coming days.
Indeed. And we really thank you for your time. And you're definitely one of the most insightful people on South African politics. So thank you for joining us on SMWX, and we hope to get your reactions to those results.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Don't forget to help get us to 100,000 subscribers. By the end of election day, we're a couple hundred away. So give us a positive rating on podcast platforms if you're listening there. And stay tuned to SMWX this election week. Aye.